people do not understand. They think that power is something that you can keep. It doesn't matter how. And as long as you can keep that power, then you are happy. But it's completely wrong, because that is then when you become rather most unpopular and you cannot keep that power. And it resonates with a lot of the issues that I have been trying to push. Because if you look at what West Africa went through and the declaration of political principles, because in the midst of the civil war in Liberia, keep in mind that there was no legal basis for the first Ecowas mission. So when President Rawlings, at that time there was President Sani Abacha, Yadima, the important thing was everybody knew the Liberia civil war was going to spread across the region, and the entire West Africa region could implode. So they took the initial decision that we must go in there and stop the spread of that war, but there was no legal basis. In any case, the Ecowas Treaty was talking only about economic integration. So in 1991, the heads of state agreed that we must have a political declaration of principles. That will be a political convergence that basically begins by saying that no more any unconstitutional change of government. So that we move away from that era of the 70s and the 80s of coup d'etats and begin to change, even as West Africa was grappling with the civil wars, to a new era where leaders emerge only because they are elected. But they needed to change the Ecowas Treaty for that principle to hold. So in 1993, we then had the Ecowas revised treaty. And so that revised treaty went beyond our outlook for an economic integration. And we then started to have the concept of supranationality when it comes to peace and security. Basically, and in simple terms, the peace of Ghana is also the peace of Nigeria. The peace of Cote d'Ivoire is also the peace of Ghana. So that when it comes to insecurity, the collective West Africa would ensure that a conflict in one country does not just become the conflict of that country, but it becomes the conflict of the entire sub-region. This will be the antecedent that will now lead to the protocols that I've been referring to. And in that regard, the important point here to make is that if you don't want any coup d'etats, you must prioritize the citizens to be not only to elect their leaders and their representatives, but to be assured that politically nothing will impede their choice and their entitlement, which is an international human right to choose their own leaders, and not only to choose, but to actively participate in the political, economic, and social governance of their country. And so we were shifting away from no more coup d'etats by telling the people of West Africa, you can use the ballot box to choose your leaders. And because you can do that, why would anybody want to change a government unconstitutionally? Now, this is the genesis in which we then had the 1999 protocol. But the point I want to underline here is if you now do anything that suppresses the electorate who must choose their leaders, that disenfranchises the people who must choose their leader, you are indirectly going back to the pre-Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, all these civil wars. Because we are telling them that your right to choose your leaders has been taken away from you. And what indirectly it means is that somebody can sit in his corner or her corner and be dreaming that since we cannot elect, we can use other means. And those other means will be illegal. And going back now to what I have described as the turbulence across the entire sub-region. And so the question that we must be interrogating is that what we want? That's not what we want. We cannot, for any reason, create any situation in which anybody who is entitled to vote cannot vote. And let me add here that even in my new role, one of the compulsory courses we had to do is the concept of the human rights up front. So what is happening is that the international community then agreed when we were setting up the Human Rights Council, because we moved from just simply looking at human rights in terms of people's rights, abuse of it, and etc. It was expanded. It's a whole range. But we, in my current role, are encouraged to talk about human rights up front. In other words, if you know that something is going to happen in which people's rights will be denied, you don't sit down, wait for it to happen, and when it happens, you don't go around and be talking about people's rights have been denied. You do the analysis about the potential of denial of those rights. And it is Mary Robinson, she was one of the human rights commissioners before the new reform. And she said the abuse of human rights today is conflict tomorrow. So if you see a situation in which about 1 million Ghanaians cannot vote, not because they don't want to vote, but because the systems have been so configured that either because they don't have a passport, they don't have a Ghana card, they are not able to go and vote, then you are denying them an international human right of political participation and the choice of their leaders. And that will constitute the conflict of tomorrow. And so we are not just talking about it in terms of whether or not people are denied the right to vote. We are talking about, are we preparing Ghana for conflict tomorrow, or are we preparing Ghana for a sustained peace? And I am very passionate that we should rather be encouraging every Ghanaian to vote, and so we make it easy for them to vote. Now, when it comes to the issue of citizenship and etc., that cannot be the basis of whether somebody votes or not. It is contingent on the institutions to find how we are all able to vote by making sure that the systems allows everybody to be able to vote. And credibility or not credibility, that's why we are human beings and resourceful to determine that. So this forms a very interesting preliminary conversation with you.
Very, very interesting points you've made there. And
Yes.
because the main point you're making is that one of the things you realized post or during the time when the Liberia and Sierra Leone conflict was happening was that if you are to build a sustainable democratic system that works across the sub-region, key thing, every democracies must be handled in a way that votes are not suppressed, or people's right to vote are not suppressed. The key question we're asking here in Ghana is whether you see, because you referred to the passport, you referred to the requirements that are being the EC has put forward. Do you see that kind of attempt to suppress votes in the moves that the Electoral Commission is making?
So, from all the expertise in terms of the conversation around this subject, and going back, I've also read documents here and there that speak to the law and what that means. It becomes very obvious. So you start with the passport. So when we started the conversation, you wanted to know what I've been doing now. So from my work, you know that I'm an active traveler. So people like me automatically would need a passport. And so to people who have residence to travel. And that's why you shouldn't be surprised it's only 2 million Ghanaians around that figure that have a passport. In fact, in this category of 2 million, we don't know how many of the passports have expired and things like that. So that is a tiny minority of the voter population. Now, the other document is the Ghana card. But keep in mind that in the project of economic and social and political integration in Ecowas, the argument was that every West African country should have an Ecowas card, except that just like the passport. You see, if you look at when we made the integration project to accelerate, we moved from the passport that had the black cover, And so you now have the green passport, and green being the color of ECOWAS, is also the color of the African Union. Then you have the Ghana, you have the ECOWAS coat of arms in the front, you have the Ghana coat of arms in the back. And so the ECOWAS card is to have the ECOWAS coat of arms and the Ghana coat of arms on both sides. So before I respond to your question directly, so there you see that even when you are talking about an identity card, it's an end product of that ECOWAS integration project. And what it means is that when you take a flight into Abidjan, or you decide even to go by road, you don't need to carry your passport, because when you arrive in Abidjan, you just show that card. Now, the purpose of the card is that the 350 million West Africans will be integrated in an identity document in which every country has a database of those documents. And that is why it is also the validation document of any resident. So you don't need to be a Ghanaian to have that ECOWAS card. But if you are resident in Ghana, you will be issued that identification document, because for purposes of development, you want to know at what each time you wake up in the morning, how many people are living in Ghana, whether Ghanaian or non-Ghanaian. So, curiously, we want to use an identification that is the end product of an ECOWAS integration project and renege on the very protocols that have put that integration project possible, which then brings me to respond to your question, and I can then expand depending on how you want me to go. So let me just take it from the 2001 protocol, and to put it in context, in 1999, the protocol, which is the main protocol relating, we call it simply the mechanism, because it's quite long. The title is the protocol relating to the mechanism for conflict prevention, management, resolution, peacekeeping, and security. This transformed West Africa because it has all what must be done to keep West Africa stable and safe in each of the 15 countries. But the document, the treaty itself basically says, should something happen to threaten the peace, this is the law. And everybody started saying, and I remember I was an active advocate at that time, that we cannot have a treaty that is only reactive. So for example, if you hear today that there was a coup d'etat in a country, the 1999 protocol details exactly what must be done, including the sanctions regime, how that country will be removed from ECOWAS. And you saw when Captain Sonogo in Mali overthrew the government there, ECOWAS suspended Mali briefly, and even went to the extent of trying to put a blockade, a complete blockade. So all those are contained. And so in the analysis, West Africa now progressed to a supplementary protocol, and that's the 2001 protocol on democracy and good governance. Now, if the 1999 protocol is to address a situation when peace has deteriorated, the 2001 protocol is basically to prevent. So it is prevention oriented. And what does that mean? So that is where I really made my reference on. So if you look at Section 2 of the 2001 protocol is on elections. And in that Section 2, Article 2, Clause 1 states the following, and I quote, "No substantial modification shall be made to the electoral laws in the last 6 months before the elections, except with the consent of a majority of political actors." End of quote. Now, if you take this protocol, what it means is, if the current CI in Parliament were allowed to mature and to become law, and that law will govern the 2020 elections, it will be in violation of this protocol, because the law would mature less than 6 months to December 7th. That's point number one. Now, the only reason why that law will not violate this Ecowas protocol is if all the political actors in Ghana consent, agree. Now, my good brother, if you go back to the previous CIs, it was not for nothing that at IPAC you have the first level of consensus building before it went into a subcommittee of experts still at the IPAC level that then drafted how will the CI look like within the framework of a consensus. Before then it arrives in Parliament, and each time, of course, the Electoral Commission is working with these actors, members of Parliament, civil society, and you name the rest of them. When it gets to the subsidiary legislation committee level, the consensus that had been built at IPAC weighs then heavily for them to agree on the CI, put it on the floor of Parliament. That law is allowed to mature and it governs our elections. But this time around, there has been no agreement at IPAC. There was no subcommittee work at the level of IPAC. In the subsidiary legislation committee in Parliament, there was total disagreement, split down. All the majority side voted for the CI, the minority side voted against the CI. So point number two, because there has been no consent, the law would only mature on the basis of the majority in Parliament. And that goes against this protocol. It violates this protocol. It makes this protocol not to have the value that it had or it was conceived to have. But in my conversation with you this morning, its purpose and its value is to prevent. And even when I was in towards my last days in WANEP, we wanted this 6 months to be extended to a minimum of 1 year. Because if you notice across West Africa, presidents who wanted to quickly amend the constitution in their favor, and I can mention some of them, but diplomatically, let me not be mentioning some of these countries yet. They try to do it before the 6 months threshold, either for their end of their mandate to be extended and that type of work. So what this does is to compel us to see the law as sacrosanct 6 months before the election. And governance experts argue that it should have even been more than the 6 months. But currently, the threshold is 6 months. And for that matter, you do not enact a law that negates treaties that are binding on you. It's like Ghana is trying to enact a law that goes against the principles of the UN Charter or the African Union Constitutive Act. In the same way, we are enacting a law that goes against the protocols that are binding. Now, the 1999 protocol was signed by President Flight Lieutenant J.J. Rawlings. The 2001 protocol was signed by President John Ajekum Kufuor. And they did it not on their own, but on behalf of all of Ghana, with the sovereignty that resides in its people. And so we are legally bound by these protocols. And it is for that reason, keep in mind that institutions evolve. We then had an Ecowas parliament. Then we said before we have a direct election to the Ecowas parliament, the political parties in the parliaments of our different states will agree on a formula of representation in the Ecowas parliament. As we speak, a Ghanaian is the Secretary General of the Ecowas parliament. My very good friend, he was my 1 year senior in school. Then the majority side in Ghana are represented by a number of parliamentarians from the MPP. Then the minority side are represented by a number of parliamentarians from the NDC. How will they go to the Ecowas parliament and sit down when in their own parliament they would have allowed a CI to mature that violates the very Ecowas protocols and institutions that have brought us together in a project of integration? So you look at it at all these levels. And what it means is that West Africans will be looking at us and saying, how can Ghana do that? And I have not talked about our prestige and our reference, because we are taken into high regard. We are taken into high regard. We are considered the reference of democracy in Africa. We can begin to tear that apart at this point. And people don't know the value. The value does not just come to a nation. It comes to us individually. And I can tell you, I can give you several examples of how my work sometimes is made easier because I'm a Ghanaian. I'm out there. I argue for the peace of Africa, for the stability of Africa. And yet, I cannot pretend that being Ghanaian, people look at me and it is like that man knows what he's doing. He's not just talking as an expert, but he comes from a country and has contributed with the knowledge that we want to have in our own countries. And I'll just give you one quick anecdote. One day in Bangui, I was in the midst of a heated argument with government ministers and representatives from the Central Africa region, the Ecowas Economic Committee of Central African States. And I was trying to argue that the way we were to go forward for dialogue to happen with the armed groups is for each of the countries to completely turn away from their national interest. Because the difference between West Africa and Central Africa is that because of these protocols I've cited, particularly the main protocol, when there is a conflict, our heads of state are not looking at the resolution in terms of how the outcome would benefit each country. They are looking at it in the declaration of political principles and convergence criteria of supranationality as a sub-region. And I found the Central Africa region to be struggling because Chad, for example, will consent about, so if there is a peace agreement, what does it mean to us as Chad? Because we have a lot of cattle and the cattle must move for grazing ground, and I can give each country's interest. When I had finished, one of the ministers said that the problem with experts like Bombande here before us is because when they are arguing from their expertise and their knowledge, they have no political knowledge. They don't have political background. They sometimes come across intellectually as if they don't have the practical political consideration. But before he finished, one of the directors in the Secretariat of ECOWAS, who works now in the office of the African Union, instead of Africa, raised his hand, and he told them, this man is only being modest by talking only about his expertise. But in case you do not know, he's the immediate past Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana. And so he's not just talking as an expert in dialogue, mediation, and peace building, but he also has served his country if you are talking about politics. And before he sat down, somebody got up and said, a deputy minister in Ghana for us would be the equivalent of you name it. So, my brother, we apologize. The Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, you are different. So I'm using this example to describe how my political role in Ghana enhanced my capacity, not just in conflict resolution and peace building, but in the political experiences to be able to help a people to move forward. And these were the steps that we took, and I told you about the peace agreement that came out of it. Unfortunately, the agreement is not being implemented as we wanted, but at least it reduced the violence, and that country is still moving forward. And so let me say that these protocols are very important binding treaties, and you cannot violate them. And that is why in my earlier comment, I said, when you violate your own treaty, then you are preparing yourself for the West. The only thing Ghanaians must know is that it looks so normal now. And then you might think that, oh, there's nothing wrong with it. And I've heard many arguments about it. Last night, I was sad to hear one Mr. Asante, who used to lead the coalition of Let My Vote Count. So he was vociferous in Let My Vote Count. Today, he's trying to support the EC that the voter registration must go ahead because the current register is not credible. Can you imagine how a human being can have? It's like he has a head on his head, but where his legs are and he's supposed to be walking are also a head. It's incredible. It's incredible what is happening to us in Ghana. Because what then happens is, if you violate this treaty, not only do you endanger your peace and security in Ghana, but you create also confusion across West Africa. And when the conflicts then begin to come, the referenced, which is that treaty that is binding, people now are asking questions about how do we deal with the case in Ghana. After all, they violated the very treaty. That is the mechanism. That is the reference point for mediation. And that is why when I made my write-up on Facebook, I talked about Ghana's leadership and prestige role across the region. If President Rawlings was able to take a leadership with Abacha in stopping the civil war in Liberia, it is because of our standing. And then when President Rawlings left office and President Kufuor came into office and signed the Ecowas protocol on democracy and good governance, he did it on our good standing. So it was not surprising, therefore, that as chair of Ecowas, he presided over the Accra talks for 55 days in Accra. That ended the Liberia Civil War. Then, during the time of President, may he rest in peace, Professor John Atta Mills, there was no substantive conflict that Ghana's president was called upon to mediate. But by the time President John Mahama came into office, and if you remember, before the elections of 2015, Togo was almost on the brink of a civil war. He mediated, and the confusion also had to do with the list, their electoral register, and who should vote. And they were able to get out of that impasse. Then President John Mahama hands over. President Nana Akufo-Addo takes over. But then there is the second round of crisis in Togo leading to the 2020 elections. And he mediated. So the question is, why have so many Ghanaian leaders become chairs of ECOWAS and mediated conflicts? It's because of our standing, the respect people have for Ghana, our democratic credentials, and what that means for others. We cannot be tearing that now and throwing it simply because we do not want a voters register, but by hook or crook, we must change it. And in changing it, we are not even prepared to respect the laws. So this will be a broad summary of some of the issues that are referred to in the article that you said I should talk on.
That's a detailed response to that question. Essentially, you are saying that we essentially are working all over Section 2, Article 2.1 of that particular protocol, because you're talking about substantial modification, and even if it should be done, it should be done with the endorsement of the major political players. Because this morning, the Daily Graphic is also reporting that the inter-party resistance against the new voter register of Ghana, which is made up of by the National Democratic Congress, which is the biggest opposition party in Ghana. And then we're also talking about APC, or People's Congress. You're talking about the People's National Convention, among all other political parties, have written to some stakeholder groups in the country. And one of the suggestions they are making is a quote. Let me read the quote that the Daily Graphic captures. It says, quote, "The country has over the years developed both formal and informal mechanisms for consensus building among the major political parties and other stakeholders on issues relating to electoral reforms, and that approach has been instrumental in fostering a culture of peace and tolerance among various political actors and institutions." They are saying that sadly that tradition of deliberation and consensus building, which was facilitated through the Inter-Party Advisory Committee that consists of political parties, civil society organizations, development partners, and Electoral Commission as the main vehicle for deliberations under the two previous Electoral Commission chairpersons, has now been reduced to a residual category under the tenure of Mrs. Jean Mensah. One of the things you talk a lot about is about consensus building.
Yes.
Should we be worried that these political parties are now saying that aspect of consensus building is out, so the EC is basically embarking on this in its own path without getting parties to agree with it? Should that be a huge worry to us, and would it be leading to what they are suggesting is a constitutional crisis?
Yeah, thank you so much. We should be very worried, and we should understand consensus building in its proper context. There is no country in this world in which constitutionalism functions effectively without consensus building. As a matter of fact, when you hear political commentators in Ghana, we know we are very good at making references to Great Britain, to the United States, to several countries. Many of these people do not even take time to know that when they refer to Great Britain, it even has no written constitution. Their laws and regulations came out of what you call political norm setting. And that norm setting became a convention and became a law. And so in Ghana, you have heard people say, oh, but after all, IPAC is not recognized in law. But that's the beauty of it. Because IPAC became a norm. And that norm setting led us to develop certain conventions. And it is in those conventions that we have informal consensus building, which then informed how you prepare a law and legitimize it in parliament. If you take that away, you are actually endangering your democratic constitutional framework. And so we should be worried, because what does consensus building mean? Implicitly, consensus building recognizes that I have to give something and take away something, and the other side does the same. And so we're looking at the best interest for our country and for all of us. So what you see actually happening in consensus building is dialogue. And the spirit of dialogue basically goes to the moral imagination of the concern for the well-being, the welfare of everybody. And you cannot talk about the well-being of a people without talking about their peace and their security. Now, if you begin to negate and erode that, then what you are going to say is, let the law determine every detail. And the question would be, can you make a law that governs every little facet of our life? And there you see that it is not possible. Now, interestingly, the current Electoral Commission decided to set up an advisory committee, an advisory body of eminent people. Over the time, the members of this eminent group, in one way or the other, have all asked the Electoral Commission to broaden consultation and build consensus. So if they should listen to anybody, why wouldn't they take the advice of the eminent group that they themselves set up? But it's important that we don't see IPAC simply because it is not grounded in law to be residual. The reason why we have succeeded democratically in the Fourth Republic is precisely because of the role of IPAC. And so we should rather be upgrading the significance and appreciating more how IPAC has become also a mechanism of conflict resolution. And because of that, has contributed immensely to credible elections in Ghana. If we downgrade that, then we do it to our peril. And I think in responding to that question, absolutely, the more you reduce IPAC and make it residual, the more you endanger the democratic process in Ghana. And this becomes very, very important for us to go back to and to consider. In any case, we go around and we use IPAC as one of the innovations Ghana has had over the years. And I have copious references in monographs of the current chair of the EC talking about consensus building. I'm sure you remember that she hosted a program in the Institute of Economic Affairs that was called a governance program. It was a good governance program. It was well funded by donors, and each political party had representation. What was that about? It was about consensus building, inputting into the IPAC. So how come the consensus building today becomes residual? How come that its significance becomes reduced? And again, we must plead to rise above any interest that might be personal or political, but endangers the peace, the security, and the welfare of the people of Ghana, and for that matter, the Republic of Ghana.
So, if to finalize two issues: one, if you have violated the ECOWAS protocol, is there any punishment? Then, two, what do you consider a proper resolution of this matter in the interest of the average Ghanaian?
So, first of all, when you violate an ECOWAS treaty, you bring the 14 other member states against you, because they will point out to you that you violated a treaty. And so, sitting at a summit, they don't have to search what to do. They simply refer to the protocol that was violated. But keep in mind that ECOWAS' predominant approach will be to mediate first. And in the mediation, they'll point out what went wrong to bring where the country departed to come back on stream. So if you remember the mediation, and I was privileged to be in the team of President John Mahama when, together with his three other colleagues, President Buhari, President Helen Johnson Sirleaf, President Kuruma of Sierra Leone at that time, they were mediating in the Gambia for the exit of Yahya Jammeh. When Yahya Jammeh was violating the protocol in which the people, in exercising their right to vote, had chosen somebody else but not him, but he, by refusing to go, was violating the protocol by disrespecting the choice of the people, they said, let's talk for you to understand that you are violating our protocol, and for that reason, we must have a reasonable way out. But whilst they were doing that, they were also brandishing, if by the 18th of January, midnight, you have not left, we would apply a stronger arm. And that was when the ECOWAS standby force was being mobilized. I'm not suggesting in any way that the comparisons are similar, but all I'm saying is there are sanctions regimes that inform what to do should the situation deteriorate to a point in which you have conflict. Because the overall objective is to prevent violent conflict, to prevent armed conflicts. And if Ghana were going down that road, there are clear, so to speak, indications, indicators, and ways of mediating first and foremost. And by so doing, helping Ghana to come back on stream. But that would have been too late because our credibility would have already been tarnished. And it will be difficult to imagine what that means in its full detail. Our worst nightmare was our immediate neighbor to the west, Cote d'Ivoire. And look at what it took for Cote d'Ivoire to recover. And even after they recovered, there are still skirmishes that indicate that they need to do more to sustain peace. So this will be in the generality of the mediation effort that informs what it means to violate an ECOWAS treaty. And then your other part of the question should be, what should be the way forward? What should be the way forward is what everybody, our National House of Chiefs, members of the advisory committee have referred to that, civil society, everybody is saying, go back to that IPAC, go back to those spaces of consensus building, and argue why it's important on the basis of principle to have a CI. Now, what that dialogue does is to be guided by the principle. And we as a country belong to a community of nations, beginning with ECOWAS, then the African Union, and then the United Nations. And each of our relationships internationally are informed by the principles that guide democracy. So you cannot organize an election by denying others the right to vote. So that's a principle. So the principle that you must encourage as much as possible everybody who is entitled to vote to be able to vote must be maintained. And once you now are able to talk on the basis of those principles, you will arrive at your CI. And I think nobody is going to say that once every Ghanaian who is entitled to vote can vote, we would have ourselves in a situation that we do not know what to do. We'll be able to get out of this situation. Then it is legitimized. But if you go the opposite, you go and make a law, but that law does not respect consensus building and is violating treaties. When you try to build consensus, the only way to talk now is to go back and amend that law for it to be neutralized or taken away before any new idea can come forward. But keep in mind that the way you have your CI maturing is not like the way other laws are promulgated. So you have to go back and go through these processes of maturity time, and that now will begin to erode dangerously into the preparations of the 2020 election. So the fundamental question at the end of the day is, are we going to have a credible election? Now, credible elections are not just the outcomes of the election, but we all want to believe, perceive, be assured and confident that the elections are going to be credible. When we are assured, absolutely convinced, then it becomes also peaceful because nobody needs to worry. But when we erode into the preparation and the credibility of the elections begins to be in question, it also raises the temperature. It raises the political anxiety. And that in itself begins to threaten the peace. And so I have a point there. All the conscious society, let me put that properly, all the respected, eminent conscience of Ghanaian society who must appeal for good reason and who normally before an election appeal to Ghanaians to conduct themselves peacefully. This is the time for them to talk. You don't keep quiet when all the signs are that if we do not have consensus and we go to an election that disenfranchises people, we are likely going to have tension. We are likely going to have a situation of insecurity. You keep quiet. And when we are about to go to the election, you say, conduct yourself peacefully. The human being is a rational being. When the human being feels that the conditions for peace are not there, they demand justice in order to have peace. At that point, you cannot control their behavior. So those appeals will fall on deaf ears. So the appeals now is, don't create a situation that will lead to conflict. That's the point I'm making. And so it's not just our political parties, civil society, media. It's also the group that is the conscience of society, the religious leaders. And but let me also be respectful. Some of them are doing that. The National House of Chiefs is doing that. But then there are other bodies who up to now are mute. And they should not only begin to talk when it is too late. And what is fascinating is they want to talk because they have raised money for elections. No, you don't need money to appeal for the right thing to be done. So we must, and I always say this, Ghana, we should not think that we are so extremely lucky and that every time we talk about conflict, but then we live in peace so nothing will happen. Who says that every time we must be lucky? No conflict ever fell from the blue sky. It is the conditions that create dissatisfaction and then escalate. And you only need a little trigger. And the dissatisfaction and the grievances that have been bottled up then escalate. And then you hear that a country has gone through a cycle of violence. That's what happened in Cote d'Ivoire. The people of Cote d'Ivoire never knew they would go through the civil war that they went through. And so this for me now becomes very, very important in terms of your very, very important input and contribution this morning.
It's been wonderful talking to you, very educative.